I spent 20 years doing what I call gallery work, where I was showing in galleries all over the country. The final show that I had was with Rembrandt in New York, with a very fancy gallery on Madison Avenue. That was pretty exciting to have a show with Rembrandt. And I'll never forget driving up and seeing my sculpture on the first floor in this big window in New York City, me. Anyway, that was a big break. So after that, life started to change. What was I going to do next? There I was. I had these other galleries which I wasn't happy about. All of a sudden, I was given a commission. There was a woman at Brandeis University who asked me if I would do some jewelry. So I did something they call a benefactor pin, and it was to raise money for the library. So I made this pin, and it was sterling silver and gold. It was called, that's vermeil. And I did a pin that looked like a bookcase. It was very, very popular. I earned some money. I did something I love to do, and I was helping others. Wow, this was sort of a light bulb that came off. It was so exciting. I started to go to various organizations and started to do this sort of thing, making jewelry, making small sculptures to help nonprofits make money. So my husband came home one day and he said, you know, there's a new dean of architecture at MIT. My husband had a chair at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Urban Planning. So as you do when somebody new comes onto the faculty, you invite them for dinner. Well, it turns out that the wife, Suzanne, was an urban planner, and she was very interested in how children play in cities and how they use the city and how they just play in general. And we really hit it off. She was very creative, and we started to talk. And she was telling me how they went into the park. They came from England. Actually, way back, they came from Australia, but then they came directly from England, and they had two boys who were twin boys who were 6 years old. When they went into the park, they strolled, and the little boy said, "Mommy, where are the ducks?" They had read the book, and when they went into the Boston Public Garden, this was the question they asked. So Suzanne, who was very creative, thought to herself, you know, Nancy, I think it would be a good idea for you to do the ducks, to create the ducks. A sculpture of the ducks. I said, what? You're crazy. You're out of your skull. How can you imagine anything like that? Well, Suzanne was very, very insistent. And she and her husband, because they were minor celebrities in town, had dinner with the mayor. And when they had dinner with the mayor, Suzanne said, I have an idea. And she told him about the idea. And he said, what you need to do is you have to find out and get a sponsor. So Suzanne found out what a sponsor meant, and the sponsor meant that you should go to Henry Lee, who was then the head of the Boston Public Garden, and you should talk to him about that. Henry Lee was very, very kindly, a lovely gentleman, and when we went to his house, he said, you know, the public garden and this whole area is my home. It's my backyard. And so we started walking around. As we walked around, he very carefully picked up various rubbish that was there. Again, repeating, this is where I live. He said, there are certain things that you have to go through in order to do this. And I'll kind of talk to the people around me and see what's going on. We went to see Mary Shannon, who was in charge of art at that time in the city. And Mary Shannon told us what we had to do. The first thing we had to do was to go to the Art Commission. What I had to do in order to go to the Art Commission was to make a replica of what I was thinking about. It's a maquette, a architectural term, but we use it in sculpture. And what it means is you make an exact model of what you want to make, and then you enlarge it to whatever size you want. And one of the things I learned was if you want to get into an artist's mind, you copy them. And I came from a very classical background at the Boston Museum School where I studied. The world is full of masters, and you can learn from these people. Even though they're dead, by copying them, you somehow get inside their heads. I learned that Mr. McCloskey, who wrote Make Way for Ducklings, and who was the person whose book I was about to hopefully make into a sculpture, had donated his drawings to the Boston Public Library. So I called Mr. Hitchings, who was at that time the head of the print department, and asked him if it was possible for me to draw and copy some of Mr. McCloskey's drawings and prints. So I went there and I spent hours and hours copying very carefully, very diligently, Mr. McCloskey's prints. I think because I did that, I was able to get into Mr. McCloskey's mind. He was an extraordinary draftsman. And if you think about a three-dimensional sculpture and a two-dimensional drawing, a two-dimensional drawing says that you have to think about an infinite numbers of views. When you do a sculpture, you actually do all those views. I chose certain ducks. This is where I decided to be very Schon-like. Instead of taking exactly the ducks that he had, I sculpted different ducks that I liked. So the configuration isn't exactly like you see in the book, but they are ducks from the book, or drawings from the book. Now, at that time, I had a 1.5-year-old grandson. One of the things about doing sculpture for children is you don't want to scare them. You want to do something that's their size. So I used my grandson as a model for how big I thought these ducks would be. I made the ducks, this maquette, with the idea that they would be 1 inch equals a foot. Suzanne and I made an appointment to see the art commission. We felt that that was very important. Eventually, we got a notice that they would accept it. Now, you can't do this sort of thing if you don't have a copyright. And so how are we going to find out? How are we possibly going to get to Mr. McCloskey? Well, I sometimes think that I'm born under a lucky star. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, I had a very, very close friend who had a house in Maine. And she just happened to know Robert McCloskey and his wife very well. She said, well, I'm going to talk to Mr. McCloskey. I'll call him for you. So she called him. His comment was, who are these wonderful women? They must be somebody very special. So he said, I'm coming down to Boston with my wife in about 6 weeks, and I'd love to visit. So we made a date. He called me, actually, and we talked a little bit, and I was scared to death. This giant of a man who was so popular, and who was I? I said I'd pick them up. The most amazing thing happened. As he and his wife were coming towards me, it looked as though they were coming out of his books. Well, anyway, I took them to my house. I wanted to show them what I did, and I had to sort of establish myself. He and his wife came in, and they looked around, and I showed them this little wax maquette. Well, he must have been impressed, because he said, oh. But his wife immediately, she said, oh, I love them. They're wonderful. Oh, well, she got all excited. He said, would you mind? I'm coming back. We're coming back for something in about 6 or 8 weeks. Would you do some prototypes? Prototype meaning that you would do the real thing and blow it up. This was a big thing for him to ask me to do. I had no money. I wasn't being paid. And I said, sure, of course I'll do it. What did I care? I thought this was a big opportunity. I was in a place called Arts Wayland in Wayland. I had never had a studio outside my house, and I had been dying to get out of the house because it was just not very pleasant to try to do anything in my dark cellar. It turned out somebody had told me about this place, and there was a studio that was available that I could rent. Well, I was so lucky because I not only got a studio, but I got a whole schoolroom. Arts Wayland was a school, an elementary school in Wayland on Loker Street, where it had been taken over by 40 artists. Well, I had this wonderful place. There was somebody who cleaned up at night for me. I had water in my studio. It was a whole schoolroom. Can you imagine a schoolroom? Once I saw a schoolroom, I realized I could do anything I needed. I could build big things. I said that I would build Mrs. Mallard and a couple of babies. That was a lot, but I said I would do that. Anyhow, it was time for Mr. and Mrs. McCloskey to return. It was October, and it was a very cold winter night, and I picked them up, and they came to my studio in Wayland, and Suzanne was there at this point. Don't forget, they're not, finished products at all. They're sketches, but they certainly looked like ducks, and they were rough. They were very rough. So we looked at them. Mr. McCloskey said, well, they look awfully big to me. I said, well, Mr. McCloskey, you're used to looking at ducks on your paper there, on your book. And when something is outside, it looks much smaller. He said, well, let's take them outside. And so they were really heavy. And it was kind of snowy and nasty, but we did. And it was kind of dark. It wasn't a very nice day, but we decided to do it. And we went out there. Well, it turns out that Arts Wayland has a nursery school. And as we were just putting the ducks down on the ground, out came some children and their parents from the nursery school. And guess what happened? You'll never believe what happened. All of a sudden, the kids went to the ducks and they started patting them. They started hugging them. They started kissing them. The four of us looked at each other and our mouths were open. It was like it was so amazing. I can't even believe this happened. Well, of course, that was it. That was the moment that we all wanted to happen so badly, but no one would have believed. It was like magic that these kids happened to come at that very moment. And so from then on, it was, the rest is history. Once this happened, we still had to go through the arts department and the landmarks department and the parks department. And then getting their approval took forever, but finally they did. Now, the next problem was the parks department, because if you're going to put something in the park, you don't want to disturb the trees or any shrubs, so it was very important. We had chosen a site that happened to be, again, I feel like I'm blessed. We found this site that was 45 feet. There were two huge trees, two very mature trees that were just 45, and I needed about 35 feet. Somebody planted them. Who planted them? I don't know, 100 years ago. And they were just the right place. And the Parks Department said yes. So we found this perfect site, which was exactly the site that we wanted because we wanted to show the site as it was in the book. The ducks had to be going in their line towards the island where Mr. Mallard was waiting for his family.